Yeah, I understand. Listen, the orange light is here because all I have in here is the light on my ceiling. Because, like most things, I totally didn't realize how expensive it would be to rebuild my set from the ground up after I moved. So, I'm getting there, step at a time. I have the most important piece anyway. Fun. There's no good way to put this. Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn is one of the slowest, most boring, poorly paced, poorly voice-acted MMOs I've ever played. It has perhaps one of the worst openings and starting gaming experiences for any theme park MMO that I've ever played, and I am surprised the game got such a bolster when it re-released A Realm Reborn back in 2013 after the already disastrous 1.0 version of the game that was released prior. I cannot stop playing this stupid game. Understand that my MMO past is rather large. I have played nearly every MMO, with my very first one being Star Wars Galaxies back in the day when I was a kid. From sandbox to theme park, I've played them all and have enjoyed many of them and hated most of them. And Final Fantasy XIV was one of those MMOs I had tried to get into multiple times over the years. Nearly every time an expansion pack came out, I tried to play Final Fantasy XIV, and I just didn't get it. I couldn't get past it. It was boring, it had confusing tutorials, it gave you so much information up front, I just kept hitting a brick wall, and I eventually gave up. Then the latest expansion, Endwalker, came out, and Final Fantasy XIV was noted as the most played MMO in existence right now, and the game got so popular after Endwalker came out that they literally had to stop selling the game and giving out their free trials because the servers were hitting 5,000 to 6,000 person queues. And even now, nearly 2 months after the game's expansion pack launch, there is still a queue to log in every single day, though substantially smaller. That shit didn't make sense to me. I tweeted that I really wanted to get into it, but it just didn't make sense and I just couldn't get past the intro. My good old buddy Jesse responded saying, "Play it, I'll play with you, and I will drag you through all of the slow content as fast as you possibly can to get you to the good stuff." And boy, oh boy, am I thankful. Because I think the entirety of A Realm Reborn is kinda bad. Now let me be clear, when I say that it's kinda bad, I specifically mean its biggest draw, the story. That story is rough. You see, in most MMOs, you're a hero, right? Maybe even the chosen one like you are in Final Fantasy XIV. And you go out and do your daily chores, you sift through poop, you kill a bunch of boars, you gather skins and you bring it back. At least they have you engaged in things. In Final Fantasy XIV, you're the chosen one, the warrior of light, in a world that's embroiled in its own political bullshit. And again, I am a huge fan of political stories. I run a Vampire the Masquerade campaign. I loved Game of Thrones books and the show up until a certain point. But Final Fantasy XIV tells its story in the worst way possible. A vast majority of the main story quests involve you having a letter to bring to somebody else so they can read the letter, tell you what they think of the letter, give you a response letter, go back to the person who wrote the letter in the first place, have them read the letter, let them tell you what they think of that particular person's response, only to get a quest to walk out to the next room, tell somebody else, and then quest completed. You didn't have to lift a finger to do any killing, you didn't have to engage in any mechanics whatsoever, you literally walk from one place to another. And don't you tell me otherwise, Final Fantasy XIV players. You all built up how amazing Final Fantasy XIV's story is. And it is. After A Realm Reborn finishes. A Realm Reborn is purely exposition and world building the story. All 96 hours of Realm Reborn are spent essentially rebuilding a world that was destroyed, getting you to know the main characters and the main players in the story that's to take place after A Realm Reborn, where you're involved in talking to literally everybody and occasionally getting to go out and do a dungeon or do some killing in a quest and actually play the game. If Final Fantasy XIV does one thing right, beyond the main story stuff of just A Realm Reborn, it respects its players' time. Never in my MMO career have I been able to play a game where I really do have to put some time and effort in to achieve things, but to a point where I can do whatever it is I want to do, usually in one night. There are reputation grinds, or grinds and dailies to do, or daily dungeons to do, like any MMO has, but none of them require days and days and days and days of grinding. usually. Hell, most dungeons, if you wanted to pop in, take maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes for a big one. And if you get to the end of a Realm Reborn, if you can power through it, and you get to your first raids, you realize their raids are broken up into individual queued dungeons. Unlike, say, something like World of Warcraft, as just my immediate comparison experience, where you jump into a 20-man raid, and it's gonna be maybe an hour or two of you going through it, the way a Realm Reborn does it is it takes what would be a wing of that raid, and it makes it its own thing you can queue into. So if you and your friends or your guild only have 30 to 40 minutes in a night, and you want to knock out one of those wings real quick, you can do it, and then not have to commit and be locked in to the rest of the dungeon. Not only that, but the game has been so honed that if you don't want to do any of the side missions in this game, any of the side quests, you don't have to. All I did was the main story quest, and then my class quests for my particular class, and ignored everything else, sparing the quests that unlock new mechanics in the game. By the end of a Realm Reborn, I was level 60, which was the max level for Heavensward, which is the expansion that I'm now going into. And it's really a big shame that the early game for Final Fantasy is so slow. As you make your first character, you really don't get to see the mechanics of your character for the first 15 or 20 levels, which is a good chunk of time to invest into an MMO to start. You have a couple of abilities that you'll be rotating, and every ability in this game is on what's known as a global cooldown, meaning if you use one ability, every ability goes on a short cooldown before you can use your next one, sparing a few unique ones. I think there's 17 classes. There might be more now at this point. I might have old information in that regard, but every one of those classes has a unique gimmick or mechanic behind it. A really good example is the Black Mage. Their unique gimmick is a constant balance between using dark magics and light magics. The more they use dark magics, the more damage their spells will do, but if they use it too much, their light spells will be way less effective, and vice versa if you go the other way. And if that sounds dangerous to you, because you're an altaholic like me, worry not, friend. This game is built for people who love alts. Every class or job, as it's known in this game, is able to be played on the same character. It's as simple as swapping your main weapon. Take away, say, the staff a white mage uses and replace it with a two-handed axe, and now you go from white mage to warrior. Your level will adjust according to where you are and where you left that class. It's not that every class stays the same level. You will have to level them individually. And where most games, crafting or enchanting or gathering things is usually just this side thing that's a spare talent that you put a few points into and then ignore, Final Fantasy XIV goes in the other direction, and every one of those crafting jobs or material gathering jobs is now a full-on class that has to be leveled from level 1 and unlocks new abilities as you go, because crafting has mini-games associated with it. Making clothing or armor is a balance of knowing when to use certain abilities, but not too often as to not break the thing you're making, and then when to know to finish what you're making so that it has good stats. One of the more disappointing things about other theme park MMOs is that when you finally get to the end game, the best gear in the game is from raids, where Final Fantasy XIV goes the other direction. The best gear in the game can be crafted by players, skilled players who are max level in their crafting profession and wearing gear that helps them make better crafting class gear. And I'm just rambling about classes. This is a simple sliver of the many great things about Final Fantasy XIV. Because one of the best things about the game is just how much stuff there is to do. You've got chocobo racing, where you can breed and raise your own chocobos with their individual stats and race them against other players and NPCs in a kind of Mario Kart Lite-esque minigame. You can, of course, go fishing. There's a ton of fishing holes to discover around the world, and the entire class of fishing, as you level it up, gets more fun and more complicated. You start fishing in oceans and lakes, and then eventually you're fishing in sand dunes, in lava pits, and down the cliffs into sky to catch skyfish, and maybe even my favorite side activity, the card game from Final Fantasy VIII, Triple Triad. This is a dangerous one because once you unlock Triple Triad, throughout the entire gaming world, there are NPCs to play Triple Triad with that'll give you rare cards and rewards for beating them. And trying to get every single card, which you can do, and you get a really cool mount for doing it, is also extremely difficult and time-consuming. All to say that there's a ton of stuff to do, and anytime you log in and don't want to do what is normal of an MMO, You have options. There's a dungeon roulette system where you can queue up for certain roulettes, like a leveling roulette, where it will pick any dungeon from 10 to 50 and throw you in there for the day. And if you complete it, you get a bonus to experience and gil for doing your daily leveling dungeon roulette. But I wouldn't have been able to see all of that stuff and unlock any of my favorite mechanics in this game if it wasn't for perhaps the best part of A Realm Reborn the whole way through. The community. I'm sure you've heard this before, but as somebody who has played plenty of other games in the past, the community in those MMOs can be extremely toxic, especially to new players who might not know certain mechanics or get in the way of those who know the dungeon better than others. Final Fantasy XIV wasn't like that, and I think there's a few reasons for it. One, this is a game that attracts not just MMO players, but RPG fans in general. While the story of A Realm Reborn is pretty bad, as someone who's just got into Heavensward and has spent maybe a handful to maybe a dozen hours in it so far, I could tell you that the story immediately gets so much better, almost instantaneously, once you move into the first expansion. But the game fosters a community that is friendly to new players at its corest base mechanics. Any player who jumps into Final Fantasy XIV gets a little sprout next to their head if they're a new player. That sprout simply indicates that they are a new player. And when you queue up into any dungeon and get put in there with a few other random players, the game always lets everybody know that, hey, there's a new player in this party. If you complete the dungeon with the new player still in your party, they and everyone else gets a bonus reward for that first player's time going through. There are mechanics at the base level built into this game that are built for older players to help out newer players through any of the first dungeons. And because of that level syncing that takes place, there's incentive to go back and do these older dungeons, ensuring that decade-old content is still played often to this day. It's so weird just stepping back and trying to put into words why I love a game that is, on its surface, relatively bad all the way through, even until its final cutscene. The story just never hooked me like so many people was hoping it was going to. But I promise you, once you get into that first expansion pack, things change for the better, all the way through. Voice actors are replaced, entire landscapes look like they have so much more money behind it, and the story is nearly instantly tense and mysterious from the get-go. It's been hard to summarize my thoughts into one video that's not going to last an hour long, talking about all the things I love and hate about this particular game, and yet at the end of the day, I'm incredibly addicted to. Because what's there, underlying the main story that so many people want you to get invested in, and you will if you get to a certain point, is a rich, full game, packed to the brim with content, activities, and interesting, unique, and deep mechanics that I didn't expect to be in a Final Fantasy Online game. I am eager to level up multiple classes to see where the story's finally going, and the dungeons moving into this new expansion have already been extremely fun. Towards A Realm Reborn, you can see them starting to mess with some new ideas and new mechanics, and with a true budget behind them in their first expansion, you watch as they go full on to explore them. So, I like a bad game, I guess, which maybe it's a bad game isn't bad, except it's good, but the main part of it is bad. All I know is I am extremely thrilled that I no longer have to listen to Sam Riegel's voice as Alphinaud.
I saw at a glance that you were a fellow traveler.